The clipboard made a sound like a small door closing when he flipped its cover shut. Frank Delacroix had been the Whitmore County Extension Agent for 11 years, and in that time he had learned to deliver bad news the way you'd pull a splinter, fast, and like it was a favor. 2,200 pounds of dead weight, he said, not unkindly, just factually, the way a man reads a feed label. Blind since spring, from what you're telling me. That's meat truck weight, Miss Castellan. Might get you 60 cents a pound if the market's decent. I stood at the paddock rail in my grandfather's canvas coat, the one still creased at the elbows from how he used to fold his arms, and I watched my breath go up in front of me and disappear. It was a Tuesday, the 11th of November, 2019, and the thermometer nailed to the tack room door had read 19 degrees when I'd come out at 5 that morning. The ground under our boots had frozen into ridges overnight, hard as a washboard, and every step Frank took toward the gate cracked ice in the puddles left from Sunday's rain. Behind him, inside the run, Solomon stood with his head low, ears turning toward sounds neither of us could hear yet. A truck 2 miles off on County Road J, maybe, or just the wind finding the gap in the north fence. He was 17 hands if he was an inch. A black Percheron gelding gone milky-eyed and clouded, and he had not so much as flinched when Frank's clipboard snapped shut 6 feet from him. "There's paperwork," Frank said, holding out a form I didn't take. "Humane euthanasia's covered under the county ag program if you file before the 15th. Otherwise you're looking at boarding and feed through a Wisconsin winter on an animal that can't work, can't be sold sound, and eats 60 pounds of hay a day like he's still got a job to do." I did the math anyway, standing there, because the bank had already done it for me. $4,100 owed to the Whitmore County Cooperative for feed since August. A mortgage note at First Farmers Trust that my grandfather had let slide the last year of his life without telling anyone, not even me. 60 pounds a day, 6 months of winter, at current hay prices out of the Bergland elevator. "He's not for sale," I said, "and he's not going on a truck." Frank looked at me the way men had been looking at me since the reading of the will in September, like I was a girl playing dress-up in somebody else's coat, waiting to get cold enough to quit. "You're 19, he said, like that settled something. "I know how old I am," I said. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anybody that morning, standing in that frozen paddock with a blind horse. If you enjoy stories like this, I've put together a special collection called The Land They Laughed At. 15 original farm and homestead stories you won't find on this channel. You can read them or listen to the complete audiobook ad-free with no interruptions. The link is in the description and pinned comment. Breathing steam behind me was that I already knew something about Solomon that made the meat truck impossible. I just didn't have the proof yet. That would come later, in a drawer I hadn't been allowed to open as a child. 3 weeks before that morning in the paddock, the letter came to my dorm mailbox at UW Platteville, wedged between a credit card offer and a flyer for a sorority I'd never joined. Cream envelope, return address for a law office in Whitmore, Wisconsin. Halloran and Voss, attorneys at law. The kind of letterhead that meant somebody had died before it meant anything else. I read it standing in the hallway of Roundtree Hall, with my coat still on, radiator clanking somewhere behind the wall. My grandfather, Everett Castellan, had passed on a Tuesday in late September, in his sleep, in the same bedroom he'd been born in 78 years earlier. The letter used the word predeceased for my grandmother, which I already knew, and the word sole beneficiary, which I did not expect. 140 acres in Whitmore County, a farmhouse built in 1931, outbuildings, livestock, and, in a smaller paragraph near the bottom, in language a lawyer chooses carefully, certain outstanding obligations attached to the estate. I called the number twice before anyone picked up. A man named Roger Voss told me, not unkindly, that I ought to come see the place before I decided anything, and that there was no rush, except there was, because the feed bill didn't stop accruing just because I was 210 miles away memorizing organic chemistry. I drove up on a Saturday, the 9th of October, in a 2004 Subaru Outback with 160,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on since August. 2 hours and 40 minutes north on Highway 61, then west past Boscobel, past the cheese plant, past a Culver's where I stopped for a malt I didn't finish. The land changed the way it always did once you crossed into Whitmore County, ridges going gold and rust, silos standing up out of the fog like something out of a dream I'd had as a kid and forgotten I'd had. I hadn't been back since I was 14. My mother and my grandfather hadn't spoken in years by then, and after she died, I'd gone twice a summer out of something that wasn't quite duty and wasn't quite love, more like the pull of a place that remembered you, even when the people in it didn't know what to do with you. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, and colder, the porch light already on at 4 in the afternoon, though nobody had left it burning for me. I sat in the driveway a long time before I got out, looking at the barn roof sagging in on itself on the north side, at the tack room door with its rusted padlock, the one door I had never once, in 14 summers, been allowed to open. The key was still under the flower pot on the porch rail, exactly where it had always been, and that small fact undid me more than the sagging roofline had. I let myself in through the kitchen door and stood there a minute breathing in propane and old coffee, and the particular must of a house that had been shutting its windows against winter for 60 years. Nothing had moved. His barn coat still hung on the peg by the door, the one with the tear at the elbow he'd mended twice with dental floss, because he said thread wasn't strong enough. I didn't touch it. I walked the barn before I unpacked the car, because I wanted to see it before dark, before I had time to talk myself into being braver about it than I was. 11 stalls, and 9 of them empty, the sawdust in them gone gray, and packed down like nobody had mucked them in a year. I found out later, from the lawyer, from the neighbor, from the bills stacked in the kitchen drawer, that he'd sold off the working teams 1 and 2 at a time, starting the spring before. Quiet auctions in Richland Center, cash going straight into medical accounts nobody had told me existed. 2 stalls still had halters hanging on their hooks with names written on masking tape gone yellow and curling. Duke, Nell, names of horses that weren't horses anymore, just tape on a nail. The north end of the barn roof had a hole in it you could see sky through, a patch of failed shingle and rotted decking, maybe 4 feet across. And underneath it, a stall floor gone soft and dark with old rain. The paddock was out past the barn, fenced-in 3-rail board that had silvered with age, and that's where I found him, standing dead center in the field, not grazing, not moving, just standing the way a fence post stands, head slightly lowered, ears loose. I knew before I got close that something was wrong with the way he held himself, that stillness that wasn't rest. I called out, I don't even remember what I said, just some soft nonsense. Hey now, hey, and he didn't turn. Didn't flick an ear toward the sound of the gate. Didn't lift his head at the crunch of my boots on frozen grass. I stood 10 feet off and said it again, louder, and nothing. Then I said his name. Solomon. And his head came up and swung toward my voice with a certainty that had nothing groping or uncertain in it at all. Ears forward, nostrils working the air, and for one long moment, in the last gray light of that October afternoon, a horse that could not see me turned his whole body to face exactly where I stood, as if he'd been waiting the entire time for someone to finally say the right word. That was the first night I understood what I'd actually inherited, not just 14 acres and a leaning barn, and a gelding the color of wet slate, but a whole set of facts nobody had bothered to say out loud until I asked. Dr. Willa Prosser, the large animal vet out of Cassville who'd done the farm calls for my grandfather since I was small enough to sit on the gate, came out that Thursday, the 16th, and shone a penlight into both of Solomon's eyes, without much ceremony. Uveitis, she said. Moon blindness, the old-timers call it. Though there's nothing lunar about it. Just years of untreated inflammation, scarring the lens until the light stopped getting through. Probably been going on 3-4 years, she said. Your grandfather knew. He just never told anyone he was managing a blind horse. Because managing a blind horse and admitting you have one are two different kinds of pride. That was the same week I sat at the kitchen table with the folder from Whitmore County Credit Union spread out under the hanging lamp, going through numbers that didn't get smaller no matter how many times I added them. $18,400. Most of it a note my grandfather had taken out in March of 2019 against the equipment shed, plus 2 years of deferred interest nobody had mentioned to me before the funeral. Mr. Halverson at the credit union had been polite about it, in the specific way men are polite when they've already decided a conversation is pointless. 19 is young to be carrying this kind of note alone, he'd said, folding his hands on the desk like he was closing a book. The farrier, Del Ackerman, came by that same week to trim the mare and looked at Solomon, standing in his stall, like he was pricing scrap. Feed's not cheap this year, he said. Corn's up, hay's up, and that horse isn't going to earn you $1 standing in a field being fed for nothing. Kindest thing, some would say, is not letting him suffer through a Wisconsin winter he can't even see coming. He didn't say the word slaughter. He didn't have to. He said it the way people say things they've decided are obvious, gentle, and certain. The way you'd tell a kid the tooth fairy isn't real. I didn't argue with him. I've learned that arguing with a man who's already made up his mind just gives him more reasons to believe he's right. I just kept doing the morning walk, halter, lead rope, the same 1,400-foot loop around the near pasture, twice around before breakfast, rain or frost or nothing at all. Because it was the one thing I could do that cost nothing but time, and because every morning when I said his name from the gate, he still turned toward it like it meant something. By the 3rd week of November, I could have walked that loop with my own eyes shut, and maybe that's why I finally started noticing what Solomon was actually doing, instead of just being grateful he was doing it at all. There's a place along the fence line, maybe 400 feet past the gate, where the ground dips into an old drainage swale my grandfather never got around to filling in. Every horse I've ever led across uneven ground picks its feet up higher there, feels for it, hesitates even half a step. Solomon didn't hesitate. He shortened his stride exactly 2 beats before the dip, like he was counting something, and lengthened it again exactly 2 beats after, smooth as a metronome, like the ground had told him what was coming, before his feet ever touched it. The first morning I thought it was luck. The second morning I told myself it was memory. The horse had walked that ground for years before he went blind. Of course his body remembered it. But by the 2nd week of watching for it, I started testing it without meaning to, the way you can't help pressing on a loose tooth. I'd vary where I stood, vary my pace, sometimes walk it in the dark before the sun came up enough to see anything myself, and every single time, right at that dip, his stride changed those same 2 beats early. There was a fence post near the old oak, split and leaning, that I kept meaning to reset. Solomon drifted a half step wide of it every single pass, never brushing it, never once catching a hip on the splintered wood, though I never once guided him around it myself. I started watching his ears instead of his feet. They'd swivel forward, hold, then relax, like he was listening to the post itself, or to something the post did to the sound of our own footsteps bouncing back at us. I mentioned it to no one at first, because there was no one to mention it to who wouldn't hear it as a granddaughter's grief dressed up as horse sense. Ackerman would have called it muscle memory and left it there. The extension office would have called it a coincidence too small to matter, same as they called Solomon himself. But I kept a little notebook of my own by then, cheap spiral thing from the Whitmore feed and grain counter, 79 cents. And I started writing down the mornings and the frost and which way the wind was coming from, because it seemed to me that a horse who couldn't see was doing something with information the rest of us weren't paying attention to, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who let a small thing like that pass by unrecorded, not after everything else in that barn had already been let go too long. Dr. Abernathy came out the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, the 26th of November, 2019, for what her postcard called a routine wellness check. Teeth, hooves, a look at the cataracts that had taken the last of his sight sometime the winter before I came home. She drove a dented Ford F-250 with a stock trailer that had seen better decades, and she wore canvas coveralls the color of creek mud, and she didn't ask me a single question about selling him, which I noticed right away, because everyone else always did. She ran her hands down his legs slow, the way you'd read Braille, and she talked to him low the whole time. Not baby talk, just a kind of running commentary. There, that's it. Nothing to mind here. And Solomon stood for her the way he never stood for Ackerman. When she got to the gate at the far end of the pasture loop, she stopped and watched him walk it instead of leading him, hands in her pockets, breath coming out in little clouds. He counts something, she said. Steps, maybe. Or he's reading the ground through his feet before he reads it through his ears. She didn't say it like it was remarkable. She said it like she was confirming something she'd already suspected walking up the drive. Then she did something nobody else had bothered to do in the 4 months I'd owned him. She stepped back and looked at him, the way you'd look at a photograph you were trying to place. Whose stock is he out of? She asked. I told her what I knew, which wasn't much. A name in the county fair program from years back. My grandfather's handwriting on a health certificate gone soft with age. She nodded slow, walked a circle around him, stopped at his head. That nose, she said, running 2 fingers down the bridge of it, over the bump that Ackerman had once called a fault, a flaw a buyer would dock him for. That's a Roman nose you don't see much anymore. And this, she crouched at his hip, pressed her palm flat against the bone there, this hip set, and the feathering on his legs, the way it grows heavy past the fetlock instead of thinning out. She looked up at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen from anyone in the county yet. Not from the banker, not from the neighbors, not from Ackerman. She looked like she was doing arithmetic that was coming out to a number she didn't quite trust. I studied a line like this in graduate school, she said. 1980-something, a monograph nobody reads anymore. I thought it was gone. I thought all of them were gone. She stood up, brushed her knees off, and looked past me toward the barn, toward the tack room door I still hadn't fully cleared out. Do you have any paper on him? She asked. Anything from your grandfather. Anything at all. I told her I had boxes of it, most of it useless. Feed receipts, veterinary bills from a clinic in Ackerman's father's time, a stack of Wisconsin agriculturist magazines, going back to 1987, that I'd been meaning to throw out since March. She said keep looking anyway, and then she had to leave for a dystocia call 2 farms over, a heifer in trouble, and she left me standing in the tack room with my hand still warm from where Solomon's breath had fallen on it. I didn't sleep well that night, not from worry this time, but from something closer to hunger. Wednesday morning, I went out to the tack room before I fed anyone, before the chickens were even making noise, and I started taking the workbench apart, the way you'd take apart something you didn't trust to be simple anymore. My grandfather had built that bench himself, sometime before I was born. The wood was gray-silver with age, the joints pegged instead of screwed, and there was a drawer on the left side that had always stuck, that I'd always assumed was just swollen from 40 Wisconsin winters. It came out crooked in my hands, and when I set it down and looked at where it had sat, there was a gap in the bench frame that was deeper than the drawer itself. I put my fingers into that gap and felt wood that gave, not solid, a thin panel set on a lip, and when I pried it up with the flat of a screwdriver, it came away all at once, like it had been waiting. Underneath was a ledger, cracked leather cover, the kind that used to come from a farm supply catalog for $1.50, the spine gone soft and pale where a thumb had worried it open 1,000 times. I sat down right there on the dirt floor of the tack room, cold coming up through my jeans, and opened it. The handwriting was his. I knew it from the feed logs, that particular slant, the way he crossed his 7s with a hard line. But this wasn't feed logs. This was dates going back to 1994, Names of mares I'd never heard him mention. Breeding records with notations in a shorthand I had to read 3 times before I understood it was pedigree tracking. Sire, dam, grandsire, going back generations. And one phrase written at the top of nearly every page in block letters, underlined twice. Larchmont line. Foaling dates. Culling decisions. A note from 2003 that just said, "Lost 2 more. Down to 6 now. Tell no one." I sat with that ledger open across my knees for a long time. Long enough that the barn cats came and went twice. Long enough that Solomon, out in the paddock, called once toward the house the way he did when I was late, and I didn't move. Because I understood, sitting there in the cold, that my grandfather had been keeping something alive in secret for 30 years, and that nobody, not Ackerman, not the county, not even my own mother, had known. The next morning, I went back to the tack room before chores, before coffee even, and found the rest of it tucked behind a loose board I hadn't known was loose. A manila envelope gone soft at the corners, postmarked from an address in Ohio, dated March of 1991. Inside were letters, maybe a dozen, typed on the letterhead of an outfit called the American Draft Horse Heritage Registry, an organization I'd never heard of, and that, when I tried to look it up later that week on the library computer in town, turned out to have dissolved sometime in the late 1990s, its records scattered or lost. The letters were correspondence between my grandfather and a man named Delbert Ashcroft, the registry's last standing officer, and they traced a slow, polite, increasingly desperate argument. My grandfather wanted the Larchmont line recognized as a distinct working strain, descended out of a nearly vanished pocket of French import Percherons that had been bred pure in 3 counties of the upper Midwest, before the war thinned the herds and the tractors finished the rest. Ashcroft kept writing back that there wasn't funding, wasn't interest, wasn't proof enough for the registry's board, and each letter after that got a little colder, a little more final, until the last one, dated November 1996, just said the registry was closing its doors for good and wished him luck finding another home for his records. There wasn't another letter after that. There was, instead, a photograph paper clipped to the last page. My grandfather standing in front of the very paddock fence I walked past every morning, younger than I'd ever seen him, hand resting on the neck of a mare I didn't recognize, and on the back, in pencil, Vesper, dam of 6, lost 4, 1997. I understood then why he'd never told my grandmother. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because by the time it might have mattered enough to say out loud, it had already curdled into something that looked, from the outside, like failure. A registry that closed, a bloodline nobody wanted, decades of feed money spent keeping alive a handful of horses that the rest of the world had already decided didn't matter. She'd died in the spring of 2015, never knowing there was a ledger in the tack room at all, and I wondered, sitting there with the photograph in my hand, whether that had been its own kind of mercy, or its own kind of cowardice, and whether there was even a difference between the two, once enough years had passed over top of it. On Tuesday, the 9th of March, Dr. Abernathy came back out with a kit from the registry office in Ames, Iowa. 2 vials, a chain of custody form, a shipping label already printed with an account number that wasn't mine. She drew the blood herself, quick and clean, Solomon barely shifting his weight at the needle, and packed the vials in a foam sleeve she said would keep overnight in the cooler at her clinic, before the courier picked it up Wednesday morning. She told me the lab could take anywhere from 10 days to 6 weeks, depending on backlog, and that I shouldn't call more than once a week, or they'd start dodging me. I said I understood. I did not, in fact, understand how a person was supposed to sit still for 6 weeks, with everything else happening at the same time, but I nodded like I did. The letter from Whitmore County Credit Union came 4 days later, on a Saturday, which felt deliberate even though I knew it wasn't. Return address stamped in the corner, my name spelled correctly this time, which somehow made it worse. Notice of default, it said at the top, in a font that didn't care whose handwriting had built the barn the loan was named after. 60 days to cure, or they'd begin proceedings. The number at the bottom was $11,400, which included 2 months of missed payments, a late fee, and something called an administrative processing charge that nobody at the branch could explain to me over the phone without putting me on hold twice. Beckhart showed up that same week, Thursday, in a truck I didn't recognize, newer than his usual one, and he stood by the fence with his thumbs in his belt loops and told me he'd heard about the notice. Small county, he said, everybody hears everything eventually, and that he had a buyer lined up for the back 40 who wouldn't wait past April. Cash, he said. No inspection contingency. He didn't mention Solomon this time. I think he'd learned that much. I did the math that night at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil that kept needing lead, and there was no version of it that worked cleanly. Selling the back 40 covered the credit union and left something over for feed through summer, but it also cut the pasture rotation I'd need if the registry results came back the way Dr. Abernathy expected. The way that would mean people driving in from 3 states to look at a horse standing on land I no longer owned enough of. Selling animals instead. The goats, maybe 2 of the younger geldings, bought me less money and more time, but time wasn't a thing the credit union had shown any interest in giving me for free. I sat with the pencil in my hand for a long while, not writing anything, listening to the furnace cycle on and off. And I thought about my grandfather sitting at this same table 30 years earlier, doing this same arithmetic, and choosing, every single time, to keep the horses. The letter came on a Tuesday, the 14th of May, in an envelope from a laboratory in Lexington, Kentucky, and I stood at the mailbox reading it twice before I let myself walk back up the driveway. Dr. Abernathy had warned me the results might take another month, that these things moved slow through university labs and volunteer registrars. But there it was in language plainer than I expected. Genetic markers consistent with the Larchmont strain. Foundation bloodline documented. 4 confirmed living descendants nationwide. One of them standing in my barn eating alfalfa like it was any other Tuesday. I called Dr. Abernathy from the kitchen phone because the cell service out past the county line never held. She didn't sound surprised so much as satisfied, the way a person sounds when a thing they suspected finally has paperwork behind it. She told me she'd already mentioned it to a colleague who worked with several old-order Amish farms in Vernon County, men who bred and drove Percherons the old way, for pulling and not for show, and that word traveled fast in those circles once a name like Larchmont got said out loud. It did travel fast. Within 10 days I had 3 phone calls from strangers, and 1 letter, handwritten, from a man named Yoder in Holmes County, Ohio, asking politely whether he might arrange to view the gelding in person, whether the last week of May would suit, whether I required payment for the visit itself. I didn't. I'd never had anyone ask. By the 22nd, a family from Iowa had already made the drive, a father and 2 grown sons. Quiet men in dark clothes who stood at the fence for the better part of an hour, just watching Solomon walk the loop I'd worn into the pasture, watching how he found the gatepost without touching it, how he turned his ear before he turned his feet. They didn't say much. One of the sons finally asked if he'd ever pulled a load, and I said not since he went blind, and the father nodded like that was the correct answer, like a horse that had once pulled and stopped was a different thing entirely from one that never could. Word kept moving the way water moves downhill, finding every low place. A woman from the registry called about documentation. A man from a magazine in Ohio asked if he could send a photographer. My phone, which had rung twice in 6 months for anything besides the credit union, now rang most evenings, and I found myself standing at the sink with the receiver against my shoulder, looking out at the barn roof I still hadn't fixed, thinking that all these people wanted to see the horse everyone at the feed store had told me to shoot. I hadn't told the credit union any of it yet. I wasn't sure how to say it in a way that would matter to a spreadsheet. The morning they all came, it was the first Saturday in March. still cold enough that breath hung in the barn aisle like smoke. I'd fixed the roof by then, patched it myself with tin I bought on credit from the co-op, and Dwayne Halverson had come by twice to check my nailing without being asked, which from him was as close to blessing as I'd get. The stall door had a new latch, a simple slide bolt I'd installed the week before, and I stood with my hand on it while 11 people crowded the aisle. 3 Amish men from Kelowna, Iowa, in dark coats and flat-brimmed hats, the registry woman with her clipboard, Beckhart with his stethoscope still around his neck out of habit, and old Vernon Tiller, who'd once told me to put a bullet in Solomon before the ground froze, standing near the back with his hat in his hands like he was at a funeral instead of whatever this was. I had the ledger open on a hay bale, my grandfather's handwriting catching the light that came slanted through the board gaps, dust turning in it like something alive. I read them the line about the sire, the dam, the year, my voice steadier than I expected. Solomon's ears found the sound before his head did. He turned toward the voices, slow, the way he turned toward everything now, testing the air before committing to it. "I'm not selling him," I said, and the word landed flat in the cold air, and I watched the youngest Amish son glance at his father. "But I'll stand him, here, under my terms, with Dr. Beckhart signing off on every breeding, and the ledger kept the way my grandfather kept it, every mare, every date, every foal." Nobody spoke for a moment. Vernon Tiller shifted his weight, and I thought he might argue, might tell me a girl couldn't run a stud contract any better than she could run a farm. But instead he said, quiet, almost to himself, "Your granddad would have drawn it up exactly like that." It wasn't praise so much as recognition, and I let it sit without answering it. The father from Kelowna asked about fee and terms, and I told him numbers I'd worked out at the kitchen table, with a calculator, and Beckhart's notes on conception rates for a horse Solomon's age. He nodded slowly, the way he'd nodded in the pasture weeks before. Solomon stood with his head lowered near my shoulder, calm, unbothered by the crowd, and I noticed I'd stopped watching him and started watching them watch him, the way people look at something they misjudged, trying to decide if the misjudgment was theirs or the world's. By August of 2020, the $18,400 was gone from the ledger of things I owed. I paid the last of it on a Tuesday, standing at the counter of the Whitmore County Farm Credit Branch, and the loan officer who once slid the foreclosure notice across a desk, without looking up, now asked me, unprompted, whether the farm needed anything else. I told him no. I meant it in more ways than the balance sheet. Dr. Beckhart drove out that same week to check a mare in foal to Solomon, a bay Percheron cross from Kelowna, and he signed the paperwork on the tailgate of his truck without the long pause he used to take before writing anything with Solomon's name on it. The foal was due in April. He told me the conception rate at Solomon's age wasn't something he'd have bet on 2 years earlier, and he said it the way he said most things now, flat, unbothered, like it had always been obvious. The tack room still smells like neatsfoot oil and cedar, but the roof doesn't leak anymore, and the ledger sits on a shelf my grandfather built, next to a newer one I started in my own hand. I read from his pages sometimes when buyers come through, not because I need to, but because his handwriting still says things mine can't yet. Solomon stands in the same pasture he's always stood in, following the fence line by feel, by the sound of my voice at the gate, by 30 years of a bloodline nobody thought was worth saving. He's not young anymore. Neither, some days, do I feel like I am. I think about the men who told me to put him down, to sell the acreage, to let the county extension agent write him off as feed truck weight. None of them were cruel, not really. They were just certain, the way people get certain about things they've never had to sit with in the dark, hand on a blind horse's neck, waiting to see if he'd trust you enough to walk. If there's a barn on your family's land you were never allowed into as a kid, or a drawer nobody's opened since a grandparent died, I'd ask you to go look. Not because there's always a fortune in it, most of the time there isn't, but there's usually a name, A date. A reason. Somebody kept something long after it stopped making sense to anyone else. That reason is worth knowing, even if it changes nothing about your bank balance. I was 19 when people decided what I could and couldn't carry. I'm not anymore. The debt's paid, the horse is standing, and there's a foal coming in spring with his sire's shoulders and, I hope, his patience. If your family's got a place like that, go open the drawer and tell me what you find.